I wish Sean had actually given me a gavel.
Nobody else can have a gavel. But
I think this group sort of needs one, or a stick or something. I'm not chairing out of any sort of, having any kind of qualifications to particularly chair this session, but just because Sean asked me to. I take the intention of this session, which I think is officially called Philosophy/Science, to discuss what role philosophy can play for scientists in pushing that forward, and what role science can play for philosophers in terms of pushing their agenda forward. I'd like to encourage a real open exchange, if we can have it, in the sense of less oppressing of pre-existing theses, which has been interesting over the past couple of days, but really just an opportunity to see if we can really ask each other genuine sort of questions about what we could do really in the spirit of moving forward. Really, is there something that we can all walk away and ponder when we go back to our various labs, desks, in my case, couch. And I'm going to let Massimo introduce, really, in terms of content, something to give us to talk about, but I think we should feel free to riff as we like on this issue of what we can offer each other in terms of kind of split two different communities, science and philosophy. What can we really offer each other, and will this dialogue continue when we leave? Okay, Massimo.
Right, so I have a special interest, I suspect. We all have an interest, obviously, otherwise we wouldn't be here, in the relationship between science and philosophy. I think of my own as perhaps a little more special than usual, simply because I have this unusual background, having been a practicing scientist and now a practicing philosopher, and having actually had gone to school for both cases. And so I feel that I have a maybe not unique, but certainly unusual perspective in having actually been a practitioner in both disciplines, and see exactly where each side comes from, when they dismiss or criticize or make fun of the other. So I'm going to put up a few slides as a way to introduce the discussion. Of course, I think that everything that you're going to see in the next few minutes is going to be very uncontroversial, so we can pack 5 minutes after this and go home, but I'd be surprised if that's actually going to be the outcome. So, we're supposed to talk about science, philosophy, and, by the way, that little thing in the middle, scientism, whatever that is. So we need to sort of agree on that one that is. So first of all, I'd suggest that we don't play semantic games, and that when we talk about science and philosophy, we're talking about the academic disciplines as they're practiced. Science cannot be taken to be just whatever deals with facts, just like philosophy cannot be whatever deals with thinking, because otherwise we're all scientists and philosophers, and we haven't said anything particularly interesting, I think. So just to make more clear what I mean by that, the thing on the upper left is a scientific fact, or a collection of scientific facts. The fact that I live nearby the Queensboro Bridge is not a scientific fact, it's just a fact, okay? So I take it scientific facts to be a subset of facts about the world arrived at by the methods of science and by the community of science, not just simple observations about how the world works. Similarly with philosophy, the one up on the upper left is actual philosophy, the one on the lower right, it's not. And that's Ron Hubbard over there.
God.
Exactly.
So again, we want to make a distinction. It's not like, oh, I got a philosophy and therefore I'm a philosopher. No, it doesn't work that way. Just this morning, I got, as a part of our Twitter feed that has been going on for the last few days, somebody made the usual predictable comment that, but philosophy has gotten so technical and academic that it's essentially irrelevant to the rest of us. And my response to that is, yes, true, but that's true for any academic discipline. Most of what scientists do is irrelevant to the rest of us. That's the nature of academia. Now, you can say that that's a good thing, a bad thing, or whatever. I think it's inevitable. But it's not, I don't see why people sort of single out this one field as opposed to, and then let everybody else pass on that account. So, Science, in my view, becomes a particular type of structural social activity characterized by empirically driven hypothesis testing about the way the world works, peer review, technical journals, and so on and so forth. That's what I mean by science. I don't mean just getting up, going out in downstairs and say, oh, there is a road across the street. That's a fact, but it's not science. Similarly, I mean that philosophy is, broadly speaking, about deploying logic and general tools of reasoning and argument to reflect on broad ranges of subject matters, like epistemology, ethics, aesthetics, and so on and so forth, as well as to reflect on other disciplines. And these are the philosophies of. A lot of philosophy today is, in fact, a philosophy of. So there's philosophy of physics, philosophy of biology, there is philosophy of chemistry, there is philosophy of language, there is philosophy blah, blah, blah. And it's sort of, you can think of that as sort of a meta-reflection on those disciplines. And of course, practitioners of those meta-reflections better be informed and respectful of those disciplines, which is not always the case. But those that are actually making interesting, I think, contributions. But contributions to what, you might say? And I'll come up in a second. So another important point, I think, is to get straight, is that philosophy is not in the business of advancing science. And we got science for that. And therefore, it doesn't make any sense to me. I hear this accusation over and over, what has philosophy done for us recently? Well, why do you think the philosophy is supposed to be doing something for you? It's not. It's a different discipline. It has different concerns, different methods, different all sorts of things. Now, some philosophy is, in fact, continuous with science. And those are the philosophies of science, philosophy of mathematics, philosophy of physics. There are certain number of papers, a small one, however, in the full area of philosophy. There is a number of papers where, if you read them, you really wouldn't be able to tell whether they've been written by a scientist or a philosopher, a mathematician or a philosopher. And in fact, often they're written by both. There's a number of philosophers who publish in mathematics or physics or biology journals, and vice versa. A number of physicists and mathematicians and biologists who publish in philosophy journals. And those are really at interface. Those are about conceptual clarification of borderline areas between science and philosophy. But that, I think, is a fairly small area. It's not the main concern of philosophy. It's not even the main concern of philosophy of. Then the question of how philosophy makes progress comes up. We think we all have an understanding of how science makes progress. Of course, there are volumes written about that sort of stuff by philosophers, among other things, by social scientists, etc. But I think in this group, we can assume that we know how science makes progress. Philosophy, I think, makes progress by a very different route. It's really, I think of it as an exploration of logical space. So you start with a certain problem, somebody comes up with a certain number of ideas, then people sort of criticize those ideas, then there is a response to those criticisms, and things move and become more complex and move away. Occasionally positions are entirely abandoned, like logical positivism, for instance. In other case, the debate is not resolved, but it has improved. For instance, the debate between scientific realism and scientific anti-realism in philosophy of science. It hasn't been settled, but there have been novel positions, and there are certainly original positions that are not tenable anymore because of criticism. So I think that is a way in which one can make sense of the idea that philosophy does make progress. Let me bring up the bad boy of physics, who famously said the philosophy of science is about as useful to scientists as ornithology is to birds. I think I agree. Now, there are different ways of cashing out that concept. The nasty reply would be, well, that's because birds are too stupid to understand ornithology, but I won't go there. It's true, and that's because ornithologists are concerned with different things from what birds are concerned with, so clearly there's very little overlap. There's one area of overlap, interestingly, however. Ornithology, one of the consequences of ornithology, of course, is that it provides information about rare birds and things that are about to go extinct, and so those birds probably should be concerned with ornithology. I'm not suggesting there is a direct analogy there, obviously, between philosophy and science, but I do think that is the capture this idea that, broadly speaking, the two disciplines are in fact separate, and then there are some areas of contact. What about scientism? Well, there's much of definitions out there of scientism. I picked on two that I think are sort of capture most of what's going on in that debate. In the strong sense, I think scientism is the view that only scientific claims or only questions that can be addressed by science are meaningful. Okay? so this, you can think of it as sort of the positivist version of scientism. In a weaker sense, or somewhat weaker sense, it is the view that methods of the natural sciences can and should be applied to any subject matter. Okay. I think the first one is undefensible. I think the second one needs to be qualified, but I'm sure that we'll have some discussion about that. I'm sorry?
Qualified. The second one is.
I think the second one should be qualified, but we can. I can get on board on some version of the second one. I think the first one is in fact too strong. For example, I think there is a pretty good number of things where science has little or nothing to say about. I count math and logic in there. I understand that a lot of people think of math as a science. I think that's not a tenable position because it's a very different kind of activity. It doesn't depend at all on empirical information about the rest of the world. It's very relevant to science, so is logic, but they're different disciplines. Certainly aesthetic, ethics, and so on and so forth. Now, aesthetics, there should be an S there. Now, even in aesthetics and ethics, I don't think that facts are irrelevant, nor do I think that scientific information of some stuff that deals with those things is irrelevant, which is why I would accept the second version, the weaker version of scientism. But largely, one can do aesthetics and ethics and logic and math without any input from science and just be fine with it anyway.
Can I ask you a question about that?
Yeah, of course.
I would say that the history of mathematics and logic are that there are discoveries. We discover something, we don't invent it.
I'm on board with that.
Okay, there's something about the difference between discovery and sort of analysis.
Mm-hmm.
And I do see that as putting math and logic somewhere in between. That they're not really a subject matter that's totally separate from science. It's a kind of science.
Actually, I quite agree, Terry. And also, you can say, suppose as a physicist, I have a physical scenario in mind which forces me or other physicists, largely string theorists these days, to make mathematical discoveries.
Yeah.
So it makes it a foggier, not just motivationally, but they're saying there is a physical reality, even if it's one I haven't yet probed experimentally, but I'm, with forethought, assuming that this is going to constrain the kind of math.
Yeah. I think that's an interesting
to discover,
discussion to have. I'd like to finish it, calling two more slides. And yeah, I think that's an interesting discussion to
Although,
have.
as chair of the session, I'm allowing people to interrupt.
Yeah, no, that's fine.
Power is going to your head.
It's a good thing she doesn't have a taser.
Actually.
Okay. Now, the other thing I think we could agree reasonably on is that, yes, a number of philosophers say bizarro things about science or even about philosophy itself. Nagel and Fodor have been two examples that have been brought up recently even at this workshop. By the same token, I think, however, we should also agree that a pretty good number of scientists say bizarro things about philosophy or even about science itself. Lawrence Krauss and Freeman Dyson are very good examples. Krauss, I think, embarrassed himself 3 times at least this year. And Dyson just did that last week. So it's
please, or at least 2 of them.
So there is the Atlantic interview. Then there is the Scientific American apology prompted by Dan, which turned out to be nothing but like an apology. And then he did a lengthy exchange in The Guardian with Julian Baggini, where I think he went even further into Dougie's holes, even further. Dyson wrote this review recently of Holt's book about... yeah, right.
Where was that from?
New York Review
Yes.
book.
Wait, but sorry, what was his statement? Can you summarize it in a
I'd
statement?
love to hear a little more content than
He said
X.
philosophy is dead now because I don't recognize the name of any current philosopher.
Oh, okay.
No good
Yes.
philosophy since Nietzsche.
Yeah.
It was just utter dicta and wandering on by a senile old man.
Yeah, that's what it was.
He said,
Well,
I met Wittgenstein once and he was really annoying to me.
yeah.
These kind of things are hardly the stuff of intellectual discussion. That's what I'm saying.
All contemporary philosophers are dwarfs.
And the really key thing is, he didn't even bother to review the book.
Yeah, the book was not mentioned in this review.
Right. I actually read the book, and it's kind of, it's okay.
So Kraus, also, I have to say I'm outside of that story, so I don't know.
Well, Kraus started out with the typical thing that I actually mentioned a few minutes ago, which is, well, when was the last time that philosophers did something, helped solve a physical problem, problem in physics, which I think, again, it's at the very least a mistaken, idea about what philosophy is about. And then when it went on in particular in the Guardian piece, talking about how science is going to give us answers to morality, basically buying into the Sam Harris thing wholesale, even though he's not even a biologist, so he's not even, in that case, he doesn't know what he's talking about, both in terms of philosophy and as science.
But just in the spirit of saying we're trying to bridge the divide, I mean, as much as I think Kraus, his comments were inflammatory, I still don't want to say things like he's not a philosopher, therefore cannot comment on philosophy. Do you know what I mean?
No, I wouldn't say
I want
that.
to be in a position where we're...
On the back of my book.
Sorry?
Somebody disagreed with you on the back of my book.
A lot of people have.
No, not on the back.
Not on the back, right.
To give a little bit more of the backstory there, if you don't know it. Lawrence, Carroll Tavers, the social psychologist, makes this great point that if people agree about 99% of things and disagree about 1%, they will, in the course of natural dialogue, they will turn each other into terrible enemies. And I think this is what has happened with Lawrence and the philosophy community as a whole. He gave a talk that was a YouTube sensation about how modern physics explains how the universe can come about sort of in a self-contained way, right, without any external designer. And it was sort of, good red meat for the atheists, and people liked it. And as cosmology, it was fine. So naturally, he was encouraged to write a book about it, right, and cash in. And so the book, but then, the book title would lead you to believe that it was telling you why there is something rather than nothing.
All right.
And then Richard Dawkins wrote the afterword.
Yes, and Richard Dawkins says that this is, up there with The Origin of the Species as an important landmark.
Which was a
event.
little of a hyperbole.
It was a tiny bit hyperbole. But the point was that, Lawrence wasn't addressing the question that philosophers take to be asked when you say, why is there something rather than nothing? And so then...
He was addressing a better question, but he should have just
That's
said
fine.
that.
So then the book was reviewed in the New York Times by David Albert, who as a philosopher does care about the actual philosophy question, and it was not a charitable review in any sense.
To say the least.
But and David says, well, it was much more charitable than all the reviews that are still on my computer that didn't get sent to the New York Times, and and it all went downhill from there.
Yes.
Actually, David came to my apartment where I had this group of mostly neuroscience, some physicists, to discuss that review and to tease apart his comments. We could talk about that, as a conversation.
But you're right that I certainly wouldn't go to the point of saying, with Jerry, we've had these discussions in the past, and I think we clarified ourselves. No, there's no territory that cannot be invaded by or talked by the other side. If we're talking about intellectual issues, I think any competent, intelligent person ought to be able to talk about it. But that comes with responsibility. So just like we expect, rightly, philosophers to get the science correct when they're talking about science, and we chastise them if they don't, again, correctly, I think the same should be going for
That
scientists.
seems to be what happened.
Yeah. Well, yes. Okay. So anyway, those were just examples. My general idea in all of this is I guess I'm a little bit of old-fashioned from that perspective, because I think actually that this whole thing ought to be sort of looked at as from the point of view of what used to be called scientia, which is a Latin word for knowledge in the broader sense. Scientia, there was actually a journal called Scientia when I was an undergraduate, and then it unfortunately closed down.
There's no more knowledge in the broad sense.
That's right. There's no more knowledge in the broad sense, which exactly, there's only techne. And in knowledge in the broad sense, there includes science for sure, philosophy, mathematics, and logic. That was sort of the broader realm of and these things are not seen as completely separate fields. They're seen as largely looking at different things in different ways, but they're sort of supposed to interact with each other and to give us sort of knowledge in the broad sense.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but I want to say goodbye to everyone. Enjoyed visiting with you all.
It was fun. Thank you. Now, I also think that that knowledge is more narrow concept than understanding. And human beings seek understanding, not just knowledge. And I'm trying to bring in a distinction here that will bring, therefore, in things like music, literature, and the broader humanities, because those, I think, as Rebecca was saying just yesterday, are necessary for an understanding, because we're human beings. We think in a certain way. We don't just think in terms of equations. We don't just think in terms of logic. We understand things in using a broad swath of approaches, which include those things. I'm not saying that, therefore, we should be doing, novelized version of quantum physics, but I'm saying that if we're talking about scientism as, this is the only way to know and to understand things, that's not going to hold. And finally, let me remind you this quote by Isaac Asimov: "Anti-intellectualism has been a constant thread winding its way through our political and cultural life, nurtured by the false notion that democracy means that my ignorance is just as good as your knowledge." I mean, this is our common enemy in the United States. There's a very good tradition in sociology of actually tracking different types of anti-intellectualism in the United States. I think we're all concerned with these kind of things. And I think we don't do any good service to the cause of fighting anti-intellectualism when we start finding about your stuff is nonsense, that one is idiotic, and so on and so forth. In fact, I would go as far as saying that any broad claim like that is itself anti-intellectual and feeds into these sort of things that is problematic in American society. So that's it. That's what I wanted to say.
Thanks. I'm sure people have comments, but I actually wanted, hopefully, to ask David. I know, David, you're over there. Are you paying attention to us? Could somebody hit David? I would really like to ask David, because David's, I think unique here possibly in being, well, this isn't totally fair, but the most experimentally oriented. Would that be fair to say? And so I think you have, a unique perspective, whereas the theorists really sometimes have to just think completely at a meta level about their work. I think, you have a different perspective.
Experimentalists don't think.
Yeah. Because David, thinking equals philosophy, and what you do is science.
That's right. Well, I mean, I think Massimo's presentation is very helpful and goes right to the heart of the matter for me. So I learned a lot, and it's been extremely valuable. But what I had hoped to learn or take away as an experimentalist is more about the putative continuity. I think you had, Massimo, in your present there, the continuity between, let's say, philosophy of science or philosophy of mind and the things that I have to worry about as a lab scientist. And that seems to me completely elusive at the moment. So I had hoped in the context of a discussion about naturalism to really find, let's say, conceptual alignments somehow between the concerns we have, in the bench or whatever you'd like to call that, and the concerns you have. And I didn't feel that at all. It's not clear to me what I'm supposed to take away as a practitioner that changes how I do my business in terms of experimental design, for instance. And what types of questions am I supposed to address in which way to deal with the challenges of naturalistic inquiry? So has that changed? So it has regrettably not changed my mind about how, what kinds of questions I can address, how to address them, and that's what I wanted, I guess. I wanted a closer, more specific alignment that's curiosity-driven, because how can we put our heads together and figure out how your philosophical concerns can merge with what we can actually accomplish, to come up with kind of mechanistic, causal stories about how stuff works. And that's not yet there, and that would be my yearning, as it were. So
here's one suggestion that's pretty close to you, actually. The bunch of experiments that were mentioned and never carefully described were Ben Libet's work, and then Soon et al. There's a whole lot of it. And some of us believe that those experiments are badly done in the first place, at least Libet's were, and that what the scientists said about them were extremely naive theoretically, and that there's now the problem that a lot of non-scientists hear these proclamations by scientists, not by philosophers, about the implications of this work, and that are ill-founded, And it seems to me here is an area where experimental scientists, if they think they've found something that is of, shall we say, philosophical importance, and they may, I certainly think there are a lot of experiments that really undo traditional philosophical ideas in an important way. That's been my stock and trade over the years, really, is pointing these experiments out and sort of rubbing philosophers' noses in some of them. But I don't think I don't think the Levin experiments are cases in point. But then there is a question about what should the experimental scientists do when they think they've uncovered something of more than interest just to their particular experimental discipline, but they think it has a sort of earth-shaking results.
I agree with Dan on this. That's one example. Another one which I could say my own work has been informed by philosophy is Phil Kitcher's analysis of evolutionary psychology. I think philosophers have the tools to be able to, the analytical tools to be able to see whether a conclusion follows from certain assumptions that scientists aren't trained to do. So the way I think about the evolution of human behavior has been changed by these philosophical ruminations. Of course, that's only because Phil is deeply acquainted with evolutionary psychology that he was able to do that. But I think there's a set of ways of thinking about things that scientists can benefit from, and you know,
so that puts that's fine. That puts the thing squarely in our court. It says we're supposed to do experimental research. Maybe it's even good. Maybe it's like Libet's experiment's not so good. And then.
But you surely internally criticize those experiments.
Anyway.
Sure.
So, but now the burden is to say, well, we think it has interesting interpretation, so I'm supposed to come running and say,
Right, so-
help me sort out the logical structure.
Right, no,
So
Dan
that's a little-
posed the question, what should they do? That
Yeah.
was verbatim your question.
Yeah.
And so you're repeating it back, what should we
What should
do
we do?
in your estimation?
Yeah.
I think in terms of Trader in the other direction, we need to attend much more closely and carefully to laboratory work. And naturalism, as a philosophical movement, shares probably universally its obligation to let what you tell us the facts are lead the philosophical and the theoretical discussion, with the critical proviso that, of course, we have to examine what the descriptions of the laboratory results are.
But I'd like a stronger version. I'd like you guys to take I would like to adopt the rich and well-reasoned philosophical tradition that inform.
You decide on your experimental agenda on the basis of where your curiosity drives you, not on the basis of some extraneous philosophical theory.
But Alex, I'm sorry, just quickly, Alex, what we do, experimental scientists often test a theory.
Sure.
And so in some sense, maybe David's asking, are you promoting any theories I can test in the lab? Would that be one way of phrasing it? Or are you saying in a sense that Jerry says?
Operationalized. That's trying to translate down, a larger scale position into, am I measuring this or that in my dish or something like that. But I guess it would be nice to find sort of the cone of direction of argumentation, or the kind of data that would, for instance, help you. That's not so
You mean
obvious.
you would like philosophy to generate the data?
No.
Experimental design from philosophy?
To generate.
I think you can get it.
Not to generate, obviously not the data. So it would be helpful to look. Let's take the discussion yesterday afternoon, which was a little weird about meaning. There's lots of stuff we know. There's great work in cognitive psychology, psycholinguistics, linguistic theory from the last 50 years that we can draw on that is actually pretty detailed, and we can test that stuff. Now, there's disagreements in this room about whether that's important or not. That would be useful to know about. Is this kind of position worth testing? Is this kind of position worth testing? In the way I then develop the experimental details and acquire the data. So I think the alignments can be more close than they have seemed to me at the moment in terms of.
I want to give Don a
this issue.
chance since I
Yeah.
know.
So I also do experiment and other forms of empirical research. And to my mind, philosophy done in the right way, that is not as conceptual analysis. I'll say in a minute how I think of it instead. But philosophy done in the right way and good science are absolutely continuous. I don't feel myself to be crossing any kind of boundary when I go from one to the other. The key problem is to do both. There are ways of doing both science and philosophy that will create a gap. So on the one hand, I regard philosophy of science as basically normatively critical history of science. Really understanding why science, why the sequences of hypotheses and the particular directions in which implications were drawn from scientific work went in the direction they did, with some assessment of, the normative aspect is, well, which things were cul-de-sacs, which things were circular errors, which things were, and what were the best instances of real progress, so that we can apply those things to current practice. Economists tend not to know very much about their own history, and if they think they know something about their own history, it's usually a myth, right? So good critical normative history of economics, I think, crucially informs good economics. I can give an example. Probably, what aspect of economics has made the most noise in the popular mind over the last 5 to 10 years? Well, a bunch of reports from behavioral economics and a certain sort of style of neuroeconomics that I think is largely philosophical bollocks, right? And to see that it is bollocks, you have to recognize two things. You both have to have an experimental program that you can explain is different from that bollocks program, but you also have to have, you can't just announce, as I'm doing right now, you can't just call it names. You also have to have a story. You have to understand how, in light of the critical history of the discipline, there's something wrong with this simplistic behavioral economics program and something better that you can do instead. So I wind up then often criticizing economists from what I take to be a philosophical point of view, but I also criticize philosophers who talk about economics largely in ignorance of the technical details. Economics is an intensely technical subject, and many philosophers talk about it without really understanding that. So, and I think similar remarks can be made about physics and biology and the whole gamut. So I don't think there's anything special about economics in this respect.
I was just going to respond in the sense that there's a conversation that keeps coming up over lunch, obviously, especially among the physicists, that there is a role for philosophy of science that's actually right there deep in the physics sometimes. And that would be, for instance, and Simon's talked about this, and Sean and Stephen and I talked about this, in things like the interpretation of quantum mechanics, where physicists really don't have a handle on what's going on, right? We can operationally do what we do with equations. It's fantastically tested paradigm, but it's not one that we actually, in any forward-thinking sense, understand, right?
Has the academic discipline of the philosophy of science actually advanced thinking in quantum mechanics, or has it been the people doing quantum mechanics themselves?
Both, but I think people like David Albert, who call themselves philosophers of science, who also, he does have a physics degree and all of that, but is very much on that cusp. I think that in some sense Don is describing in economics and philosophy that people are very much on that cusp, is pressing people to think harder, but what do you mean by the collapse of the wave function? What do you mean by the many worlds interpretation? And if we keep scratching at this one area where we clearly have a massive gap in our comprehension, maybe we'll make an actual real live physical discovery. And I think that's a genuine place.
Actually contributed to
Yes.
better understanding. And
Yes.
that and the Arrow of Time are the two, I think, very clear examples where philosophy of physics has helped physics.
And it may continue in things like the landscape. We won't go into it all now, but in that sense, it's a little maybe closer to David's, hope in that it gives people who are on that cusp of trying to understand fundamental physics some tools and changes the goalpost, moves the goalpost.
Certainly has happened in the philosophy of biology, and I think almost everyone at the highest level of evolutionary biology recognizes the name Samir Okasha, because he's Samir Okasha, who's a philosopher.
I guess I don't know.
Doesn't know.
That's right. And who's sort of laid out the levels of selection problem and the relevance of Price's equation to this debate in a way that, at any rate, I've heard scientists on BBC say, well, we're not going to solve this problem, we have to leave it to Samir.
I know Owen wants to say something, but also not to unfairly demand that the scientists have a right to tell the philosophers what they ought to be, right? We don't have to say, look, this would be better for us, you better give us what we need, right? You obviously have your own programs, as I think Massimo laid out, but Owen?
I was just going to, I was a little bit worried, because I know time is short, that our discussion would yet again be too abstract in general. I think that in answer to David's question, like, here's one thing that just struck me, and I have no horses in this race, although I'm really interested in it as an outsider. So there's a history of, so here's a way I think we make progress. The devil's in the details. The history of reflection on the nature of time. So we know, for example, that the physicists in the room have to think about time, and we know that there are controversies in physics about the nature of time. Then there's a lot of work in psychology about, classical work on phenomenology of time, Bergson and people like that. And then there's the kind of work that David talked about yesterday, where we get this sort of data that shows that the brain doesn't care about time at a certain level of granularity. I think having people sit down who have particular contentful perspectives to bring on a problem, and then have them talk about how, because a lot of, Alex mentioned the other day Ed Wilson's concept of consilience, there's ideas of unification or reduction or consilience. I mean, this is just an interesting topic, I think, and as soon as David spoke about that, I thought, boy, I had heard about his work on this, but I think that's really interesting. Now, again, I don't work on it, so I'm never going to write it up, but the point is, those kind of discussions, it goes back to what Massimo talked about. The division of intellectual labor is such that sometimes you don't meet people who do things that are that interesting until you come into a room like this. And,
you wouldn't even know the information was there to be had.
Yeah. So I guess one way to put what I just said is, I don't think there's any general answer to the question of what's the intellectual division of labor and how should it work. I think there's, the fact that Alex says everybody knows Samira Kosha, and the most distinguished evolutionary biologist in the room doesn't know Samira Kosha.
The levels of selection problem was laid out by Lewington probably before that. I mean,
And many others.
Well, I actually second, Okasha, I think, has made the kind of contribution in this 06 book, is made the kind of contribution that both biologists and philosophers ought to read for the next 20 years.
So I'm wondering.
That's a big claim, but
Big claim, yeah.
Rebecca and Sean?
Consciousness, I know there are, probably all of us here, don't look very kindly on philosophers who have made a huge thing over the hard problem of consciousness. However, by concentrating so much on consciousness and what would be required for an explanation of consciousness, the kind of thing we were talking about in the first lecture, and entailment, and do we require entailment, do we, or something less? Have they had any effect on? My sense is they have. They've redirected cognitive science to a certain extent.
I think that the area of cognitive science is just a happy hunting ground for philosophy for a very simple reason. They haven't figured out exactly what questions to ask yet. And there have been a lot of interesting false starts.
So and the they is the philosophers? Or
no, the cognitive scientists. And I mean, just look at the history of psychology. Look at the brave tries, the Skinnerians and the Gestalt psychologists and the introspectionists and we've had wave after wave of enthusiasm, and almost certainly none of this is stupid. There's always an important contribution to be made, but it's not been anybody's specialty within the science to sort that out from a sort of a bird's eye view and talk about, well, what in the end does Skinnerian psychology offer after we subtract all the confusions? Isn't there a message there? I'm one who said yes for years, and I think people sort of came around to a lot of that. And similarly for sort of every enthusiasm we've had. Complex dynamical systems. Right now, the current hot topic, and I think for very good reasons, is predictive coding and Bayesian approaches to modeling in the brain. These are very tempting perspectives. And so very smart people succumb quite properly to the temptation and throw themselves onto one bandwagon or another, and then there's a merry chase. Now, that's very different, I think, from what happens in physics. I don't think there's anything quite, maybe it isn't so different. I don't know. I'll let the people who know much more about physics than me.
You said scientists haven't figured out which questions to ask, or just scientists in that particular field?
In those areas, I think
Okay.
of course, this is me speaking. I find sort of leftover Cartesian assumptions everywhere. People that just somehow can't rid themselves of the idea that there's a place in the brain where I am, and where everything comes in, and that's where the consciousness happens. That's the Cartesian theater, as I call it. And if I put it as baldly as that, your average cognitive scientist say, "Oh well, of course, I don't believe that." But then.
So there's bad science. I mean, big deal.
Yeah,
You know, that's. I'm
But
not-
the fact
I'm not
is,
moved
there's
by
a-
that. There's a lot of, but there are a lot of the questions that are on our board are actually, addressed by, sometimes even, not bad cognitive science. How do you make a moral judgment?
Yeah.
What does it mean to make a decision? Is it free in some, operationalized sense? So, is there conscious experience? What does it mean to recognize a word and its meaning? Are those improper questions?
No.
I mean, those seem to me the questions at the very much at the center of what we're trying to figure out, and those don't seem to be improper.
Not to force you to contentious position, but are you saying, look, as scientists, we're going to, critique each other effectively internally and identify that as bad at the level
I
of
think
science?
so. I think that there's so take the neuroeconomics case, from which I agree that that's a lot. That's just kind of bollocks, to use your. I don't think I needed to come to philosophy to realize that. I can take those experiments over pretty well myself. Not being a philosopher, there's shitty experiments with false assumptions and bad techniques.
But then there's also
So
there's also a less well-known good kind of neuroeconomics.
There is. That's right.
Right.
So but do we need? Does that require an interaction between the sciences and philosophy, or experiment to come to that? It doesn't follow.
No,
right? I
it
think-
doesn't require it, but it doesn't even
Does it
preclude
help?
it either, right? I mean, we can get good ideas from whatever they come from. I'd like to make a small comment about actual practice. Again, I feel that I do have an interesting perspective from that point of view because I've done both. We were talking, some of the discussions going on about, well, do scientists really need philosophers to come up with this broader view of whatever? Sometimes yes, sometimes no. Let's not forget that the practice is in fact very different. When I was a scientist, especially in the last 10 years, most of my time was spent writing damn grant proposals, okay? Because the funding rate at NSF is 5% at this point. So it was
philosophy with just no money at all. And don't
right. So it's ridiculous. Now, what that means is, so you put that one on top of course, so your teaching, duties and your graduate students, and the interaction with my graduate students was much more intense as a scientist than as a philosopher. And as a philosopher, what I do with my graduate students, I'll see you next Thursday at a wine bar and we'll chat for a couple of hours, and that's about it. As a scientist, every day you're in the lab, every day you have to solve practical problems, there's field work to be done, there's data analysis, there's a bunch of stuff, which does not afford most scientists until they take a sabbatical or until they get close to retirement and start doing philosophy. As Jerry actually once pointed out during a seminar at Stony Brook when I was there. You just don't have the luxury of stepping back and taking a broad look at a large amount of literature in different fields and say, oh, let me see what I think about it. The philosophers, if they do their job right, which clearly it's not always the case, have that it's not the luxury. That's what they do. Right? They don't have to write grant proposals mostly. They don't have laboratories mostly. They don't have graduate students that pester them every day. They do have usually more teaching to do, but whatever. So the intellectual division of labor, it's not just intellectual, it's practical. It's a matter of, there's only so many hours in the day and there's only so many things you can do. And so why not take advantage? Now, David, that doesn't mean, again, couldn't I figure out that one is a bad idea? Yes, of course you can. But there may be other things you didn't pay attention or you're not thinking about because you got busy doing other stuff. And so if somebody comes in from the outside and says, hey, have you noticed that? Why not?
I'm sorry. Okay, Don and then Sean. I'm conscious of the fact that I keep skipping Sean.
Doing good. Sure, thanks. Doing good. Good reflection on the relationship between philosophy and science is actually quite hard. right? Because there's a lot of, as with anything else, there's quite a lot of such reflection that isn't very good. And also, I think when different stories apply in different cases. So let me give one example of what I mean by bad stuff on both sides. Economists have a tendency to use as rhetoric when they're arguing with each other the claim that some behavior that somebody else's model would require an economic agent to display isn't rational. Right? They use this word, rationality. It's usually largely empty rhetoric because they mean different things are meant by it from one occasion to the next, and relatively few economists have really thought very carefully about what they want to mean by that. But then, on the other side, philosophers will have a tendency, philosophers of economics have a tendency to approach that issue by doing conceptual analysis of rationality, as if there is a thing rationality should be and they, the philosophers, will discover it. And that's also nonsense, right? But what I think the actual crucial role that needs to be played, and it can only be played by somebody who's pretty well versed in that kind of normatively critical history that I'm talking about, which I think is what philosophy is, but also understands the constraints on applying things in real work, in empirical work. What you need to do instead is not trying to identify what rationality is, but simply be very, very clear on how different ideas about rationality have played actual roles in the history of the best work that has actually made progress in understanding, so that you can then come back into the current debates and say, all right, here's something that is not merely empty rhetoric that you could say instead, right?
I just thought it might be useful to flesh out the example of the interpretation of quantum mechanics as a place where philosophers have been useful, and in thinking about it, since I had to think for the last 5 minutes, also a place where philosophers sort of dropped the ball a little bit, because they could have been useful earlier, right? And it's clear why the different communities play different roles, because the scientists very often, and for very good reasons, want to figure out what happens, and then later we'll figure out what it means, right? And so quantum mechanics is a great example where we had this half-baked formalism of the Copenhagen interpretation, and there's a classical world that observes the quantum world, and that was good enough for many, many years for really describing the experiments. And people point out that it wasn't really good enough because it made no sense, but it still was okay. And it's only in last couple decades that there's been a lot more discussion about that, and partly it was the philosophers pressing on it, but a crucial role was actually played by physics, because our experiments are able to probe at what used to be the inaccessible boundary of the quantum and the classical. So we could make an anti-philosophical argument that, back in the 1930s, the philosophers could have really just insisted that this was making no sense and tried to do better. But now that we need to do better, because the experiments are pushing us that way, the philosophers have been very, very useful in explaining mistakes that the scientists have been tempted into. So there's the many worlds interpretation, which just says the wave function evolves and it splits into different worlds, and there are bad objections to that, which the philosophers have.
Good objections.
No, bad.
Bad objections. There are also good objections, but there are bad objections, like there's too many universes. That's a bad objection. Right, exactly. But then there are also, again, since the scientists want to say, well, I want to figure out what works, and then we'll get to the details later, the idea of deriving the probability rule, the fact that the probability of getting a result is the wave function squared. A lot of physicists would just say, well, let's just add that onto the Everett interpretation of quantum mechanics, to the many world. Let's write it down as a postulate. And it is the philosophers who have been saying, you can't do that. It doesn't make logical sense. It's against the other, it's not quite, doesn't fit in with the other rules. And in fact, they're the ones who press on the need to understand what's going on, because on the one hand, the many worlds interpretation doesn't have probabilities in it anywhere. And some of the scientists who think they're doing the hard work of deriving the probability rule from the many worlds interpretation, what they're really saying is, if there is a rule for probabilities, it must be this one. And that's kind of the easy part, and the hard part is explaining why it's a theory of probability at all. And that's exactly in the philosopher's wheelhouse to sort of address that question in a deep way. Now you might at the end of the day say, okay, and if this philosophical nudge moves us to a better understanding of quantum mechanics, I don't care because I still know how to calculate things in quantum mechanics. But I think that if it does, it sort of immediately gets absorbed into what we consider the useful physics research program. You know, what kinds of experiments teach us something when we have entangled quantum states very, very...
And you are making that assertion.
Yes, and I am making the assertion that...
that we understand more about the universe now than we did before, without the presence of academic philosophers of physics.
Sorry, I didn't quite understand that sentence.
I mean, you said it didn't really matter to you whether the progress of science whether science had progressed more or because of the lucubrations of academic philosophers.
I'm saying that, you know, the philosophers missed a chance in the earlier years of the 20th century to have a big impact on the development of quantum mechanics. But now they are having a big impact on the development of quantum mechanics, and I think that they will.
Yeah, before the physicists ran into trouble, were they listening to philosophers?
Yeah, like,
you know, it
You guys are
depends.
intimidating.
Well, they didn't listen to Einstein
It's-
when he offered the EPR in 1935.
Did they listen?
No.
No.
They didn't listen to
Yeah.
Einstein.
Yeah.
They didn't listen to John
Yeah,
Bell.
exactly,
When he did it,
right.
when
No.
John Bell made great advances in our understanding of quantum
So,
mechanics.
A fortiori, they would not listen to.
That's okay. They could have
That's
been
a
philosophers and
it's a
figured
good
it out.
point.
You know, they could have just done it. I mean,
Yeah.
it wasn't a matter of needing new data, right? You know,
Yeah.
we knew enough to come up
there's
with a
a
better
sociology of this
interpretation
thing,
of.
too, right?
No, but it is a
Absolutely.
good point, that until you really get your foot stuck in a trap,
Yeah.
you might not turn to help.
Yeah,
from anyone.
certainly not to philosophers. So I wanted to point out something, I don't know if it's so much about philosophers and scientists, but philosophy and science, and that is that philosophy is damn hard to do, and it's particularly hard. We all have philosophical intuitions. I was very, impressed with your saying something which I think is true about cognitive scientists. Deep down, they're relying on Cartesian dualism. Philosophy is something that most of us don't want to think about, even philosophers, right? You've got your intuitions, and until you really run into trouble with them, they're just buried down there and they're percolating up and and scientists, this is very true for as well. In fact, that conversation I had, that for me, pivotal conversation with Sidney Morgenbesser when I was an undergraduate, when he convinced me to go into philosophy of science rather than philosophy, and he said,
rather than physics.
rather than physics. What did I say?
You said philosophy.
Freudian.
There's a disconnect between the brain and the words. But what he said was, scientists are capitalists, right? It works and they just keep going. And, philosophers are communists. I mean, they're constantly rethinking the basic system and they're keeping it, the questions are always on the table there. And do you want to be a capitalist or a communist? And this was the 1970s, and my answer was clear, right? What I want to be. But the thing is that bad philosophy creeps in to physics all the time. And the case that I particularly think of is the one that you really, Boltzmann, right? I mean, that he presents a fantastic, solution to the arrow of time, and nobody buys it because they've got bad philosophy. The whole scientific community has bad philosophy. And so, it's really the role of philosophers to just keep these questions, this is an open question, and to just keep pushing this, these questions are open, and that it can affect, and in pivotal times in the history of science, it has
And
science,
and
right?
the sociological fact, philosophers, I think, just have to get used to the fact that until they find their foot trapped, they're going to be very rude about our attempts to move in and say, wait a minute, I don't think you're clear about this. I mean, I think much the same thing happened with consciousness. After 1990, suddenly, everybody's writing a book about consciousness, and Crick and Damasio and Linas and Christoph Kochen. Everybody's got to have their book on consciousness. And they try to write these books, and then they think, uh-oh, this is hard. and they stumble around, and most of those books are pretty bad.
And
actually.
think they're answering questions that they're not answering.
the good thing that's come out of that for us philosophers is that there's a lot of much more modest people in cognitive science, in neuroscience now than there used to be, because they've come to realize that they do not have a handle on how to talk about consciousness.
And just to pile on that side of the argument, when philosophers do make a very helpful intervention and set things straight a little bit, the reaction of the scientists will be, "Oh yes, I get it now," and then that's obvious. I knew that all along, right? And they will never remember.
But they
the
do that to
philosopher-
each other. I mean,
Exactly,
come on,
right.
you don't think, My hope is that one day somebody says that's obvious, because that means I penetrated right through that facade scientifically.
Talk about quantum mechanics. It's like half you're going to think this is trivial, half you're going to think it's complete nonsense.
Yes.
I'm just trying to move people from the nonsense to the trivial. Can't. Right?
Well, I love to criticize my colleagues. I just want to, play a diplomatic role for a second and say that sometimes the rudeness, in fairness, is coming from very vocal, very prominent few. And actually, I think most scientists feel very humbled by their field, honestly, and are more respectful of people. I agree with Rebecca 100%. Not even philosophers want to talk about philosophy, think about philosophy all the time, because it's so hard. I mean, I am very aware that sometimes in my own work, I'll rub into something which is getting into that issue, and I want to go calculate, because it's so much more pleasant. I know I'm going to get somewhere in the end. It's like washing dishes. I know it's going to be done, And so I think that most scientists are more receptive, maybe, though less vocal. I just want to be a diplomat for a second. I think Jerry had something, and I want to get to this side of the table too, like Simon and Terry, who have a foot very much in both fields.
Yeah, I just wanted to say a word for science. Maybe I'm just being overly sensitive, but what I sense here is an attempt of everybody to tell philosophy and philosophers how great they are, and no attempt to do anything but diss scientists. I mean, this is maybe an exaggeration for not doing the experiments right, by doing the Lebet experiment right, for not understanding cognitive research properly, and for writing books about consciousness which are bad. And yet maybe this is implicit in the whole conference, that science has done good stuff without. What this, to me, the whole conference has been a philosophically dominated catering to philosophy and how great it is. And I just wanted to speak up.
I was worried somebody wouldn't be contentious.
I think even Massimo said, 90% of science does and should ignore philosophy, and I think that's almost uncontroversial. And that's why I tried to give my little example of a case where the philosophers clearly dropped the ball and could have done better.
Yeah. So
and
when you
they're
say,
like, well, you would have ignored us anyway, but still.
Yeah.
Can we have an example, maybe, from a case where really some compelling mechanistic explanation of some phenomenon was generated because of an intervention by philosophy, whichever field, biology, physics, where that really changes, that was game changing.
Do you count Einstein's description of special relativity and the role of Leibniz and Berkeley and Ernst Mach in his thinking? It's a pretty good example.
That's pretty good. Okay.
If I'm right about quantum mechanics, it will be an example.
Look, I think there are
those are big.
There are mainstream examples. You can't in cosmology come up with a theory which puts human beings as special without getting a lot of flack for that. I mean, this is clearly a massive shift, starting with Copernicus and onward, where it's just it's a philosophy that human beings should not be special, and it's mainstream, and it's may or may not be very deep, but it's not acceptable anymore, and to the point where string theorists and cosmologists are arguing very hard about things like the landscape, the possibility that there's multiple universes, that the only reason why the universe looks this way just happens to be because we're here asking about it. There are these sort of anthropic principles, and they are debated heavily among hardcore string theory scientists, and whether it's an acceptable program to pursue or it's a weak program to pursue, the anthropic one, for example.
And it's kind of debated badly, and maybe the philosophers could help out.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think being expected to be good at that is a fair, criterion, just like you're expected to be good at your experiment, is a fair, level at which we should uphold our work. I think, Owen, were you making sounds? Terry, were you making sounds? Sounds? Speech-like sounds that resembled English? I'm going to come back to you. I'm going to make you say something, Simon.
So one of the places when I went out of cosmology and physics into the sort of interdisciplinary realm of the Institute, when I teach, I need to have read philosophy quite a bit. Just because making connections between two disciplines, being able to kind of analyze, I wouldn't necessarily call it conceptual analysis, but I was just thinking here, right, so some fields, this is not bad science, these are really good graduate students who come, and they can't see the difference between a simulation and a theory. Right. And this is not something that physicists have had trouble with because we have a
new way of doing experiments on our computers.
Right, so this is, and I mean in physics, right, so simulating the thing is not as high status as making a theory of it, but, so we have that kind of already there.
Numerical experiments.
But, so that was one huge thing, right, and if I didn't realize that you had to make a case for this, you had to be able to distinguish this, but if you can't communicate. You can't transfer the methods of one discipline over to the other if you can't quite line up it's like the USB ports all have different sizes. And the other one that came up was causation. So every field has a totally unanalyzed notion of causation. And if you don't realize that causation is normative, fundamentally normative, and you don't know what normativity is, or at least just have some folk account because you read occasional books about it.
Why is causation normative?
Yeah, I got stuck there.
So I can program a computer to find correlation, right? I have lots of mathematical tools to find correlation. If I want to find causation, I have to have a notion of an intervention, right? So many of us work with Yehuda Pearl's notion of causation, which is fundamentally about what's an intervention, right? An intervention in a neural experiment is not going to look like an intervention in a social system. Those kinds of notions are, I put it this way, they look unscientific to me, right? The do operator is not an operator.
So intervention is, that's the landmark for normativity. That's what you're saying. It's just,
yes.
So you're just using the word in a funny way.
That's fine. Yeah, I'm happy to say.
Why that's normative is what we're wondering about.
Why that's...
It turns out it's not normative. It's just means the standard invoked by my discipline. The norm in my discipline is to invoke this standard for calculation and to vary from distance and discipline. That's all.
Thank you. Yeah, that's exactly right.
It's not normative.
I didn't mean to use.
Yeah.
So there's. Okay,
that's. So notice how interesting this is because it's a. You were, Simon, talking about how important reading in philosophy is to thinking about certain things, and then that's very helpful that there's this confusion, but now the philosophers are saying, so it's not normative.
So do you want to know how philosophers do this?
Well, let me just finish quickly. So that notion of the do operator, it just doesn't seem scientific to me.
Yeah.
But I want a thought through public account with smart people who are behaving well, and to tell me how I can use it and how I can resolve difficulties with that particular do operator. And my guess is that the philosophers are the people best equipped to help me do that. I might be wrong. I might be that there's some, that the debates about norms of explanation, for example, they're not going to help me with that. That might be the case.
I mean, maybe this is, to follow Rebecca's instinct, a nice moment to have like a 5-minute, with the philosophers helping us out with notions of causation and normative in this context.
When I look at accounts of mental causation, they don't. Like that's where I first saw it a long time ago. It doesn't seem to connect to proving whether X caused Y and those kinds of things. And I don't know, but I would love to have a 5-minute seminar.
Anybody want to give us a 5-minute seminar on?
You posed it in the context of consciousness, I guess. What would count?
What would count
as a satisfying causal explanation, but meets some standard of normativity, I guess.
You're not going to get a single agreed upon answer from the philosophers in this room. No.
But now we can get error bars. So we can get 5 opinions and with error bars.
Right, I think that's actually an interesting point. Sorry. That exchange right there, it's typical. It's like, philosophers often say things like, and scientists immediately jump on this thing. Oh, well, we're not going to get one answer because, the joke is you got 10 philosophers in the room, you get 11 opinions. No, it's not. You get constraints on those answers. You may get 2 or 3 viable answers, but it's not anything goes. It's not like anybody's opinion goes out. No, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to imply that you said that, but this kind of exchange, it's actually representative of what I hear outside of this room. And I think we should put a stop to it, and qualify it.
That having been the meta conversation, does someone want to tell me what normativity and causality are?
Sure.
Rebecca wants to tell us.
Well, I mean, in general, normativity
Uh-huh.
usually brings in a notion of evaluation, right? Would you, there's, you know,
Correct, incorrect.
better.
Good and bad.
Correct, incorrect, right. But
Correct,
good, bad,
incorrect,
right,
better,
wrong.
or worse.
Uh-huh.
True,
Oughts.
false.
It has to do with oughts.
It's got oughts in it,
Uh-huh.
exactly. So it's not, you know, it's, there's some kind of evaluation that is implied.
What's an ought?
So-
I mean, Steve Weinberg would say you ought not to do this.
Is this an explanation? So when,
Oh, sorry, wait.
so when you were talking about causality, and I thought maybe you actually meant explanation because you were using the term normative. So the notion of explanation is implicitly normative, because, you know, what counts as a good explanation is a implicitly normative concept, right? Because, you know, we have many, many explanations. We can always, as Coyne taught us, we can always generate more explanations given the data. How do we sort them out? It's a sorting, you know, there's a kind of sorting mechanism.
So it's not
that's
causation
involved.
at the level of billiards.
There's
Dan.
two big sort of families of normative ideas in philosophy, of varyingly spelled out. What I call Pittsburgh normativity is very much about ethics. And the other notion of normativity is just about good and bad. But, you know, good hammer, bad hammer, that's a value judgment too. But it's more about functionality. And the way I distinguish it is I say, if you want to remember the difference between them, think about the negative case. It's the difference between being naughty and stupid. If you fail to meet the Pittsburgh norm, you're naughty. Bad. If you fail to meet the functional norm, you're stupid.
So
Nature takes care of extinguishing the things that fail to meet the second norm, and society tries to extinguish the things that fail to meet the
The
first.
kind of normativity you need is the kind of normativity that says, if you have a Phillips screw and you want to stick it in a piece of wood, you ought to use a Phillips screwdriver. You ought not to use a flathead screwdriver. That's the kind of normativity
That's a good example.
that's relevant to your concern about causation.
There's a little bit, but to a certain extent, it's like if you want to do the kinds of things we do, and maybe I'm just repeating this in a more abstract way. If you want to do the kinds of things we do in sociology, this is the kind of intervention that counts when you build the mathematics around your causal analysis. And if you want to do the kinds of things you do in psychology, even if it's the same system, right? You should imagine a different kind of intervention.
Do you
and
have
then
a
follow
good
it.
example of that? Because I see what you're saying, but I'm not convinced that there really are cases like that, that are good. That is to say, I'd like to see a case where the sociologists are in effect right to have a different norm for intervention than the psychologists would use in the same circumstance.
I can give
You're
you
in
a
favor of
toy
the unity of
example.
science, evidently.
So Dan, I can give you a toy philosophically
Okay.
sounding one that I wouldn't never do, but so someone goes to a bar, gets drunk, drives home, kills somebody on the road. What caused that? Right? So if you're a sociologist, you might ask questions about the larger social system, right? Depending on your notion of history, you might say, you know, I'm gonna look at this from social practices that go all the way back. So my intervention would be, you know, 100 years ago. That would be the cause. These, you know, if I'm a psychologist, I'll take a different set of causal pathways, right? Is this there? It seems obvious that every different set of field goals will have different interventions.
At the beginning of this, somebody brought up on Honoré, the philosopher,
Who was it?
at the beginning of our meeting.
Oh, it was Richard Dawkins.
Yeah,
Tony Honoré
This
was
is a point.
fellow.
This is a point well established in the philosophy of history and the philosophy of law back in the 1930s. That different perspectives will lead you to identify different among the causally necessary conditions as the cause, and it's silly to argue which of them is right when all of them are causally necessary, jointly sufficient, and depending on the interests of the inquirer, one or another will be more salient.
Doesn't that make the question of causality, as people ask for solutions to cause. When a scientist asks for cause, doesn't that make it normative?
No,
That
it
seems
makes
to be-
the question of causal explanation normal.
Oh, I think I see what Simon's point is, especially through the lens of Judea Pearl. When you're looking at through a Pearl lens at causation, you have choices about what to consider as the intervention, and those choices are very dependent on what sort of inquiry you're doing, because of just the point that you made. And so there are normative questions, because you may say to yourself or your colleague, look, you fool, you're making the wrong intervention given your purposes, given what you want to figure out. You're not asking the right interventionist questions. That's normative, I suppose.
Explanations might be true, but some of them are good explanations and some of them are bad.
And this fits right in with what Alex's example of the Phillips screwdriver.
Mm-hmm.
If you're and to really take your own case, there is now, I think, an ill constructed debate going on about whether we should turn away from looking at culprits, at agents that have done evil, because when we ask questions about them and whether they could have done otherwise and so forth, we're asking the more serious causal questions we should be asking about sociological conditions and economic conditions and so forth. And the attention we spend looking at the culprit, the accused, are distracting us from better causal inquiries. Now, as I say, I don't think that's a well-formed discussion. I think it's ill-motivated.
But you feel it should be better formed, or you just think you were about to say it's ill-motivated, and I cut you off, sorry. So you were answering my question. You think it's ill-motivated, and not that it should be formulated better.
I think there are questions in the neighborhood that are very good, and it should be asked. And we certainly should get at the social causes of criminality, let us say, for example. But I think the idea that we shouldn't also ask questions about whether this particular individual could have done otherwise is just mistaken. Mm-hmm. I think you do both.
Let me just bring it back to Massimo's point, right? So this is a wonderful conversation for me. I find it very liberating. Because if you get a room full of scientists and you say it depends upon your goals and your beliefs about what is good, and they say that's crazy. Integral x dx doesn't depend on my goals and needs. There's a strict answer, and also it's not a matter of taste or preference for different kinds of explanations. Whether or not you use the Shannon form of entropy, it has the correct properties. That's the one you've got to use. No debate. And then all of a sudden, halfway through your lecture, somebody raises their hand and asks one of these questions that gets you into a question about, I guess, the normativity of explanation. And if you start giving them a fuzzy answer, they might say, well, this isn't science, you're a moron. And if you can't give a solid account, as you guys have been giving, they're either going to walk out or they're going to not change their discipline, or you're not going to be able to communicate. And so this is really valuable.
I think actually that goes back to David's question about how philosophy can help the scientists, or can it, ask questions, maybe not design experiments, but I think the sort of simple-minded answer is that philosophy helps us decide which questions are interesting, right?
That's one. The other one is more to the, that would help. We should be so lucky. The other one is to give an interesting account of what counts as an explanation. Right. That would actually really help, right? So I have my own pre-theoretical, intuitive sense of what I think a causal mechanistic explanation is in my world. Yeah. And I kind of make it up but I think it's, I try to convince myself that it makes sense. I postulate a set of primitives and then I try to use the interactions between those to account for the phenomena in a sort of principled manner. Hopefully, you can even
I
formalize
think
it.
that's Steve Weinberg's point, that he was pointing towards a different example, but, it's not that we don't use philosophy, it's that we often just use bad philosophy, and
Right.
sometimes better
We're
philosophy
lazy
is useful.
philosophically.
That's right. So that's the flavor of
Could I
thing
ask
that would
a-
really help out.
Let me
Yeah.
ask a
I wanna
very
get Owen
specific
and then
question.
Don. Yeah.
It's just, it's actually, it's fascinating, because sometimes, I mean, I don't think I shared Jerry Coyne's view that this is a celebration and of how great philosophy is, but, I do feel sort of, gee, it's like a kumbaya, at the end of this. It's wonderful. So here's a very specific question I can ask David, because I told you how I thought your work, and I think it has been taken seriously by some philosophers who work on time consciousness. I could be wrong about that. But I wanted to ask you back. You said it'd be nice if philosophers could tell you what a mechanistic explanation is. Now, there's a group, like Peter Mackamer, Carl Craver. Have they had any influence? These people are the people who claim that they've got it down, and they interact all the time with cognitive scientists and cognitive neuroscientists, and all they write about or Bill Bechtel. So you heard his name. So that's just interesting, right? Because there is a group of people who claim to do this very thing, and you didn't hear about them, just as you hadn't heard about Samir Oshaka. Nor have you. So this is kind of just a feature of the intellectual division of labor that's right sort of in front of us right now.
I was going to comment on that same problem with the intellectual division of labor, the gap between philosophers' conversations about, for example, causation and the relevant discussions among the very scientists that, I mean, a glaring example at the moment in my field is there's a very hot debate, methodological debate going on in economics right now over what you need to do to try to establish what we mean by causal hypotheses, which is how you identify the statistical properties of a data generating process, right? We take ourselves to be doing a kind of information science. Well, writ large, right? So not just in the narrow sense. Now, it's hard these days because there are sort of two styles that are competing with each other. Linear estimation using instrumental variables on the one hand, or identification of structural models on the other hand. It's hard these days to get through an empirical paper in economics without somebody getting into a quarrel over that. But the philosophers of economics and the economic methodologists, who are mostly philosophers, so far have been totally unaware of this, right? So there are debates going on about causation in economics that economists don't recognize and have never, would not regard as a real problem. The economists are having an argument over how to think about causation, and the philosophers don't know it.
So I want to also, your comment about this kind of a celebratory, triumphalist philosophy fest. But that one of the things that really sort of struck me when you sent the list of questions was, these are all these are hardcore philosophical, free will, morality, reality. What else do you have there? I mean, meaning. I mean, this is the hardcore stuff. Philosophers didn't have something, a lot to say about this. And these are all philosophers who take science very, very seriously and try to absorb as much of, as the relevant science as is possible, but yet have more to say, even one would hope, than the scientists. Well, there's just no excuse for philosophy departments then. I mean, it would have to be, it seems to me, that the philosophers would have a lot to say here. This is hardcore stuff. So what they spend their entire lives thinking about.
Yeah, and to address that question, I'd just like to ask a reciprocal question.
Before you start, I'm aware of the time that we've run out, and Sean's holding a coffee cup and waving it at me. But I want to let you reply, but after this, we're all going to have a chance to kind of do our little summaries and crisscross again. So, but do you want to have this opportunity now?
Just a reciprocal question. Again, maybe I'm hypersensitive, because the questions are philosophical ones, of which I feel somewhat incompetent to address, and feeling more incompetent as the conference goes on. I'm wondering, and I'm informed that when scientists try to do philosophy, or that's the impression I get, they generally screw it up. And I'm wondering if philosophers can think of cases in which scientists engaging in philosophy have made a positive contribution.
Yeah, but
Yeah, yeah.
the remarkable
yes.
thing is, my favorite example is the one who hates us most.
Feynman.
The nature of physical law. QED.
Are you sure he hates philosophy so
Well,
much?
you know, there's this poster child.
Well, he said the one thing. I mean, it's out of context. I mean, does anyone really know the real context? This is
No, he was
Okay, this is-
abusive about philosophy. But he was,
this is coffee conversation. Where's my gavel?
that's my example.
Quotes
But
are not out of context.
maybe there are others.
Oh, I'm so conciliatory.
John Bell.
John Bell.
Judy Pearl.
Einstein.
Einstein, right? Examples of what? People who influence philosophy.
Look, just since I have the chair, I want to support Alex's statement too, because I've been thinking a lot about Einstein's, special relativity, and in particular, he took a philosophical stance in the beginning by saying, "I don't believe anyone should be special." I mean, it's a very philosophical position, really, and that from there, and the constancy of the speed of light, he's willing to throw away the nature of space-time. I mean, that's pretty enormous
But
physical
Leibniz had already
undermining.
done a significant amount of the work for it.
Fair enough, but what I'm saying is his philosophy was front and present in terms of a first step in moving forward. Okay, thanks, everybody.
One more Darwin.
Okay, everyone gets one more next time.
There's also a very obvious example
Darwin's good.
of
I
a
like that.
scientist doing bad philosophy and therefore holding back science, which is Ernst Mach in Germany in the later part of the 19th century.
Denying
He chose not to believe in atoms for philosophical reasons. He was a
Yeah.
scientist, but he said, well, you can't observe
It was a
them, and
positivist.
therefore.
Bronowski said
But
that
come on, this-
Boltzmann killed himself because he thought he'd lost that debate with Mach.
Well, you know
Not a
what?
true
It's
statement, but
I'm
it's
gonna
true.
write a novel about
Can I
that
just
someday.
say-
I think it's a fantastic novel.
It is. It is. But I'm looking forward to Rebecca's novel on Boltzmann. That's for sure. And Boltzmann's killing himself is the first line of my first book. But just to say, we're allowed to make mistakes, though. So we got to be careful between bad philosophy and making a genuine error. You know what I mean?
Right, but this is an example of a scientist just wading in, thinking that they can do philosophy better.
So
than
in a normative sense, it was stupid.
That's
Dan, you had
Darwin
a-
said somewhere
And
in his notebook, famous quote we all know, origin of man solved. He who would understand monkeys would do more for metaphysics than Locke.
I think
Nice.
baboons. wasn't it?
Baboons.
Can I give Dan his,
1837.
you had one, because in fairness, I skipped over you wanted to throw one down? Oh, you just said Darwin.
Darwin.
I just said Darwin, yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
thanks, everybody.
Einstein on quantum